I'll speak for myself, but not about myself, except to apologize for my appearance. Dennis Cooley and I were arguing a point of philosophy over dinner, and he was very emphatic that he was right. So it's a pleasure to be here. It's my first trip to Fargo, and nice to see the famous Red River firsthand. I follow it in the news every year at just a little earlier than this season. My paper is entitled "The Nature of Evil," and I should say that part of the motivation for this paper is to try to find a new perspective on the problem of evil, and in particular to relate it to one of my main interests philosophically and ethically, which is in nonviolence and the philosophy of nonviolence and the ethics of nonviolence. And it seems to me that part of what needs to go with a philosophy of nonviolence is a different way of understanding the concept of evil from what one finds commonly in the media and among government and social leaders and so forth. So with that, let me present the paper. The 20th century witnessed the Holocaust, an unparalleled evil in the eyes of most people, as well as attempted genocide in Rwanda. The beginning of the 21st century saw the launching of the so-called war against terrorism, proclaimed by then President Bush to be a struggle of good against evil. But what is evil? If we don't know what we're struggling against, we're unlikely to be successful. We can kill plenty of people, of course, but without an understanding of evil, we won't know that we're killing evil people, or even people who, if they're not themselves evil, are doing evil. Different understandings of evil emerged historically as religious power gradually receded before secular power. As Tolstoy put it, and Tolstoy was interested in this issue as well as in the issues of nonviolence, and I'm quoting Tolstoy, he says, "Men who were vested with sanctity regarded as evil what men and institutions that were vested with civil power considered to be good, and vice versa, and the struggle became even more acute." Nietzsche took the stakes in the contest to prevail in the defining of evil to be even more momentous. They were at the center of what he saw as an historic struggle between superior and inferior peoples. The multitude of inferior persons, those embodying the values of what he called slave morality, redefined as evil what was by nature good and labeled as good what was by nature bad. And Nietzsche, as you know, argued for a transvaluation of values because he thinks things had been overturned through this redefinition of good and evil. What is clear is that without an understanding of evil, the way is open to defining it as one pleases, and in the process to responding to it as one pleases, typically with violence. Tolstoy once again perceived this, quoting Tolstoy. "Previous to Christ's teachings, it appeared to men that there was but one way of solving a struggle, and that was by resisting evil with violence. And so they did, each of the contending parties trying to convince himself and others that what each of them considered to be an evil was a real, absolute evil. Men have employed violence against other men and have assured themselves and others that they have employed this violence against the evil which was acknowledged by all men." In Tolstoy's view, the principle here is that of defining with authority what is evil and resisting it with violence. While perhaps not recognized and consciously acted upon as a principle, what Tolstoy describes arguably represents the common practice of communities, societies, and states. But of course, those representing different communities, societies, and states often have different definitions of evil. President Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire during the Cold War. I happened to hear that. I happened to be in Moscow at the time, and I was having lunch with a Soviet journalist, and it was very difficult under the Soviet Union, if you were a foreigner there, to get any news from outside. But I heard from him that President Reagan had just declared that the Soviet Union was an evil empire, and the journalist was very offended by that. President Bush later branded Iran, Syria, and North Korea the axis of evil. The U.S. itself has been called the Great Satan, a way for some Muslims of saying that it epitomizes evil. Now, we can scoff at such accusations against us, but do we understand them? And if we don't understand them, can we justifiably dismiss them at the same time that we make similar accusations against others? Tolstoy thought this attempt to define evil with authority in such a way that it would be recognized by all persons is futile. He therefore concluded that the attempt to resist evil by violence is useless, serving only to perpetuate violence and conflict. Gandhi made a related point when he wrote that satyagraha, that is his method of truth force, as he called it, his nonviolent method that he labeled in South Africa and then took with him to India when he struggled for Indian independence from British rule. He wrote that satyagraha, and I quote Gandhi, excludes the use of violence because man is not capable of knowing the absolute truth and therefore not competent to punish. Both Gandhi and Tolstoy were making an epistemological point, to put it philosophically, that we lack the requisite knowledge to be justified in resorting to violence. Tolstoy thought this was so because we are incapable of effectively forcing others to accept our own definition of evil as authoritative, and absent such acceptance, violence will only beget more violence. Gandhi thought this was so because he believed that absolute truth is required to justify punishment and the use of violence, and we simply lack such truth. Whether the required knowledge is specifically knowledge of evil, as Tolstoy held, is unclear, but much of Gandhi's philosophy suggests that it was. The Tolstoyan principle contains two claims. The first is that men are unable to define with authority what evil is, and the second is that men are unjustified in resisting perceived evil by violence unless they have defined what evil is. I want to focus initially upon the first of these claims, but I want to move it away from the question of defining evil authoritatively, which meant for Tolstoy entitling those who hold power to use violence in the service of that definition, to the question of defining evil philosophically, whether or not any such definition is acceptable to all persons. I shall then take up the question of the use of violence to confront evil. I want at the outset to emphasize the distinction between what is evil and what is bad. There is kindness, compassion, happiness, and joy in the world. These are unquestionably good. There is also pain, suffering, malice, and misery. These are unquestionably bad. Good and bad, along with better and worse in associated terms, are not only part of our ordinary discourse, they are, as Kant saw of concepts of causality, space, and time, part of the conceptual tools by which we understand the world. We can scarcely go through a day without making at least implicit value judgments of good and bad, better and worse. And I think if you just reflect on it, you'll see practically from the moment you get up in the morning till the time you go to bed at night, if you don't make them explicit, you are making value judgments about better to do this, better to do that, this is good, that is bad, and so on. And that's part of the conceptual framework by which we operate in a practical way in the world. Where does evil come in? Granted that we can make good sense of the notions of good and bad. Adam and Eve ate forbidden fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, not of the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. A toothache is bad, but it isn't evil. Destructive hurricanes and earthquakes and floods, if you like, are bad, but they aren't evil. My point is that evil isn't part of the natural order. It's not a force in the natural scheme of things. And I include by the natural scheme of things the effects of the actions of non-human living things upon other living things. The lion's killing of the lamb is awful, or at least awful to watch, but it's not evil. Nor is the lion herself evil as she nestles with her cubs with the gentleness of the lamb she has just killed. Plague and pestilence spread misery and death, but bacteria and locusts are not themselves evil, even as they sicken or kill millions of people. We do, it is true, sometimes use the term evil interchangeably with the term bad. Thus, one might read in an ethics text that utilitarianism calls for maximizing the balance of good over evil, or that morality is the study of good and evil. When what is bad rises to a catastrophic scale and magnitude, it's sometimes called evil, and sometimes, especially catastrophic natural events, have been deemed to be evil on theological grounds, that they are the works of Satan or perhaps of God himself, punishing human beings for some wrongdoing. This loose way with the term evil isn't what interests me. That is, evil in a broad sense, which is interchangeable with good. Our ordinary language is sufficiently flexible that we can, and sometimes do, use the term interchangeably with bad. But if we fix upon this use of the term for philosophical purposes, then we'll have to distinguish among various kinds of evil, that of a tornado, for example, from that of a terrorist bomb. We already have different terms, namely the terms bad and evil, readily available for this purpose, and I propose to use them. Let it also be said that we often use the term evil with a pronounced emotive or expressive meaning, as philosophers like to call it, a meaning, say, of disapproval or outrage, and of trying to evoke similar emotions in others. Calling the Soviet Union an evil empire was Ronald Reagan's way of expressing disdain for the Soviet Union, and undoubtedly of trying to encourage the same feeling in others, in Americans, the audience that he was speaking to. These emotive uses of the term also aren't what most interest me. My interest is to try to clarify a descriptive or conceptual meaning of the term, one in which evil and badness are distinguishable. That there are bad things in the world is incontrovertible. Whether there's evil in the world, and if so, in what forms, is an open question. My aim is to try to clarify the nature of evil in such a way as to enable us better to understand this question with a view to making progress toward answering it, and answering it in a way that illuminates its importance for the philosophy of nonviolence. And it's in this sense that I propose to explore. Now, even when we distinguish between evil and badness, there are two ways of approaching the problem of evil. One, we can start by assuming that there is such a thing and that we need only to find ways of stamping it out. The only philosophical question of great interest then is how to reconcile the existence of such evil with the existence of a good God, if there be such. Or, a second way of approaching the problem, we can start by trying to understand what evil is, leaving open the question whether anything corresponds to it in the world. Just as we can define the conditions of a just war without assuming in advance that there are any such wars, or we can define a unicorn even though we know that there's nothing corresponding to a unicorn in the actual world, so we can clarify the idea of evil while leaving open the question whether there is evil in the world. We can also define, you can give a clear definition of a square circle, but we know that there aren't any such things. So explicating the concept of something can be separated from the judgment of whether or not it corresponds to something in reality. Given that the first course immediately puts force, that is, assuming that there is evil, given that the first course immediately puts force, threat, and violence to the forefront as prime candidates for eliminating evil, the second course is the one I propose to take. It is, I believe, the course counseled by a philosophy of nonviolence. I shall try to clarify the meaning of the term evil, not in the sense of what people have before their minds when they use the term, but rather in the sense of what they would have before their minds if they thought the issue through in greater depth. So in part, if you like, in philosophical terminology, I'm offering something of a normative definition of evil. That is, I'm proposing a way of thinking about evil in a way that's useful for discussing the issues of violence and nonviolence. Now, it might be objected that to start by leaving open whether or not evil exists, or more particularly, whether or not there are evil people in the world, flies in the face of the obvious. Wasn't the Holocaust evil? Weren't Hitler and Stalin evil? And shouldn't such judgments be the starting point of any discussion of evil? Not necessarily. We should be mindful that much of Eastern philosophy contends, as with Taoism, that people are basically good, that the bad they do has other explanations than that people are evil. Even much of early Western philosophy holds the same. For Plato, or at least for Socrates, we recall, all wrongdoing is from ignorance. Good people often are ignorant. Indeed, on Plato's view, most of them are ignorant of the most important things in life. And for Aristotle, wrongdoing owes both to ignorance and to weakness of the will. And basically, good people can be weak-willed as well as ignorant. For both Plato and Aristotle, there are other explanations of wrongdoing than postulating that it is done by evil people. And the Greeks and much of Eastern philosophy has a very different conception of human nature than is characteristic of later Western thought, particularly as influenced by Christianity. We should not start by assuming that the bad things people do, and in some cases the horrendous things that they do, are explainable only by assuming that they are evil. Some people cause untold harm to themselves and others, but this is consistent with their being good by nature. We can tell for the most part whether people do bad things by observing their conduct. But I shall argue that we can't tell whether they are evil simply by observing their conduct. There the matter is much more complicated. From a theological perspective, it's sometimes said that there is no evil in the natural order because God, being good and the creator of all things, wouldn't create evil. A popular solution to this so-called problem of evil, as it's often called, is to locate evil in the doings of humans in their exercise of free will. This seems to me to be essentially correct, but one needn't believe in God to hold that there is no evil in the natural order. One need only recognize that evil presupposes minds. Without minds, there would be no evil. Mark Twain recognized this when he said, or he asked satirically, he said, "What now do we find the primal curse to have been? Plainly what it was in the beginning, the infliction upon man of the moral sense, the ability to distinguish good from evil, and with it necessarily the ability to do evil." And then he adds, and this is the important part, "For there can be no evil act without the presence of consciousness of it in the doer of it." If there is no evil in the natural order, then evil, if it exists, is produced, and it takes minds to produce it. That is why, leaving aside religious and supernatural assumptions, there is evil in the world only because there are human beings in the world. Or to give it a more Kantian cast, only because there are rational beings in the world. What is it about minds that is relevant to the production of evil? 4 elements warrant consideration: beliefs, intentions, motives, and feelings. Without at least the first 3 of these, I suggest, there would be no evil in the world. But all 4 are involved in the paradigm cases of evil. So I've got beliefs, intentions, motives, and feelings. Let us see what it is about them that's instrumental to the production of evil. If we look at much of the harm that people deliberately inflict upon others, we see that it's done in the belief that the harm is deserved. When prison officials strap a person to a gurney and release toxic chemicals into his veins, they believe that the person deserves to die. When troops attack a vehicle in Iraq or Afghanistan now and mistakenly kill a family inside, they believe, at least when they act, that they are killing terrorists and that terrorists deserve to die. In the first case, the belief is a moral belief. In the second case, a moral belief combined with a factual belief. The factual belief that the persons inside the vehicle are terrorists happens to be incorrect, and usually they find that out very soon once they look at the vehicle and open the door and look inside. The moral belief in the two cases may or may not be incorrect, but they are widely accepted. We can say further that the intentions in the 2 cases are, if not good, at least not bad. The prison officials intend to kill the condemned person, to be sure, but beyond that, if we're being charitable about their action, they're intending to carry out an order in keeping with a judicially mandated penalty, and thereby helping to hold society together. The military personnel responsible for the attack on the women and children in the vehicle intend to destroy what they believe is a legitimate military target, and they are authorized to do that. On a grander scale, many Christians believe that human beings deserve to suffer because of original sin. And even if some people burn for all eternity in hell, that too is deserved, even if they happen to have been born before Christ and not have had the opportunity to repent. That's one traditional Christian way of thinking about sin. There's the original sin. Original sin is transmitted through all of the descendants of Adam and Eve, including all of us. And human nature becomes corrupted through that original sin, and it's only through divine grace which, according to the traditional view, is a gift from God, but it's not a gift that we deserve. It's the goodness of God that leads God to extend divine grace to us. Those who don't accept that end up in perdition. Evil in the full-blown moral sense I have in mind isn't simply the result of mistaken beliefs or of misguided good intentions. We sometimes hold people accountable for mistaken beliefs if they should have known better, if, for example, they were negligent in gathering the necessary facts before acting. A whole branch of law, tort law that is, deals with issues of this sort. And we sometimes judge people harshly who act rashly with the best of intentions. And remember that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But this doesn't warrant saying that they are evil. Carelessness and misguided good intentions are shortcomings, and good people often have shortcomings. We probably all are negligent or act on misguided good intentions at one time or another. Evil is different. A paradigm evil act is one in which both the intention and the motive are evil. Our intention is that which it is our purpose to bring about by an act. That's my definition of an intention, that which it is our purpose to bring about by an act. Our motive, on the other hand, is that which explains why we intend to act as we do. A person's intention in turning the key in the ignition is normally to start the car. The motive, let us say, is the desire to get to work on time or get to the grocery store or whatever. Just as there can be good and bad intentions, there can be good and bad motives. Typically, good motives are love, compassion, kindness, and benevolence. Typically, bad motives are greed, envy, selfishness, and malevolence. An evil intention, we can now say, is an intention to inflict undeserved pain, harm, suffering, deprivation, or death upon others, as an end usually in itself rather than as a means to a supposedly greater good. An evil motive is one of malevolence, a desire to inflict undeserved pain, harm, suffering, deprivation, or death upon others. This means that no act by itself, that is, simply considered as a physical event apart from its mental constituents, intentions and motives, is evil. That is, simply looking at an act as a physical event does not enable us to say that the act is evil. Its evil is derivative from the motive and intention lying behind it. But this also explains why evil originates in minds, because only minds, or more exactly only beings that have minds, have motives and intentions. Since there's nothing in the nature of mind, understood as a capacity to reason, make decisions, generalize, make inferences, that is evil, this means that evil, when it exists, is produced by minds. It's not something existing naturally, either in the mental or in the physical realm. It comes into existence because of rational beings. But there's a fourth element of minds besides beliefs, motives, and intentions, and that is relevant, and that is feelings. When evil is personified, as it often is in caricatures, cartoons, and so on, it's often pictured as grinning, enjoying its evil ways. And this certainly is part of the paradigm of evil, the taking of pleasure in the infliction of harm. But it's important to distinguish this element in the paradigm of evil from other notions to which it's closely related, specifically sadism and Schadenfreude, the German term for which there's no simple equivalent in English. Sadism, of course, is taking pleasure in the infliction of pain upon others, but it typically involves being the agent of the pain inflicted, or in being in some way responsible for those who are the agent. And unlike in the case of evil, is sometimes consensual. Masochists often enjoy having pain inflicted upon them, just as sadists often enjoy inflicting such pain, and they sometimes come together precisely for that purpose. While some evil is sadistic, all sadism need not be evil. Schadenfreude, on the other hand, is taking pleasure in the misfortune of others, whether or not one is the agent of the misfortune. One may be an observer, even a chance observer. People cheer when the opposing team fumbles the ball, or when the villain in old Western movies gets his just desserts. They may be pleased at seeing others embarrassed or suffering accidents or coming to financial ruin. Some feel a little glow of pleasure when they see the car that just passed them at breakneck speed being ticketed a few minutes later down the road. there is a moral element in some of these feelings of satisfaction. Why is this element important? To answer this requires taking account of beliefs once again. In the paradigm case of evil, the suffering one inflicts is undeserved and known to be such. This distinguishes evil from the punishment a parent inflicts upon a child for perceived wrongdoing, or that society inflicts upon a criminal for a capital offense, or the violence the military inflicts upon perceived enemies, or that God inflicts in consigning persons to eternal damnation. Indeed, John Stuart Mill says, and I'm quoting Mill, that it's universally considered just that each person should obtain that, whether good or evil, which he deserves, and unjust that he should obtain a good or made to suffer or undergo an evil which he does not deserve. So the notion of what is deserved is central to understanding this concept. William James noted that in the perspective of what he calls subjectivism, I'm quoting James, he says, not the absence of vice, or he might have used the term evil, not the absence of vice, but vice there and virtue holding her by the throat seems to be the ideal human state. People take pleasure or satisfaction in that, and a lot of movies exploit that, and they manipulate our feelings in such a way that all of the violence that takes place against the evildoers, people applaud and cheer and so forth. The suffering of those believed to be condemned to eternal hellfire by God is greater in both kind and quality than could possibly be inflicted on them by all of the evil people that have ever existed. That is, if there is such a thing as hell, and if hell, at least in part, includes an eternity of suffering, pain, burning, and so forth, then the quantity of pain or suffering that is inflicted is far greater than any human beings or all human beings collectively could do. Yet those who believe in a just God don't think that God is evil for inflicting such suffering. And the reason why not, it's thought to be deserved. Human beings deserve suffering if they aren't obedient to God, don't have faith in God, and so on, and ultimately because of original sin. Taking pleasure in seeing pain inflicted upon those who are thought to deserve it may or may not be commendable and may be even bad, but it's distinguishable from evil. Pulling together these various considerations, let's say that moral evil encompasses evil acts, evil motives and intentions, and evil persons themselves. So I'll characterize an evil act as an act whose motive and or intention are evil. An evil intention is having as one's purpose to cause undeserved pain, harm, suffering, deprivation, or death to others. An evil motive is the desire to inflict undeserved pain, harm, suffering, deprivation, or death upon others. And then an evil person is a person in whom evil motives and intentions predominate, or who characteristically takes pleasure in the undeserved pain, suffering, harm, deprivation, or death of others. For the sake of simplicity, I would offer the following general definition of evil, namely intentionally causing or taking pleasure in the undeserved suffering of others. Now, some points of clarification. One's intention might be evil without being accompanied by an evil motive. Some consequentialists might argue, for example, that if a vastly greater good could be achieved by inflicting suffering on some innocent people, and therefore undeserving people, then that should be done. The intention and the act in that case would be evil, but the motive would not. That one's act will cause undeserved suffering can, of course, be known, foreseen, or foreseeable without being intended. Philosophers talk about a principle of double effect. The principle of double effect trades upon this. Contrary to the principle of double effect, however, which allows that a good, or at least a neutral act, may be done if, among other things, its bad consequences aren't intended. I maintain, however, though I won't argue it here, that if one knowingly does what is bad or harmful, that suffices to establish the wrongness of an act, quite apart from the principle of double effect. Philosophical issues there that I'm just going to skim over that we don't need to be concerned about. If there were a devil, and if he wanted to maximize undeserved suffering in the world, he could scarcely do better than to contrive to get basically good people to inflict such suffering upon one another by their own hands, not his, in the belief that by so doing they were combating him. Let me read that once again, that if there were a devil, or if there is a devil if you like, and he wanted to maximize undeserved suffering in the world, he could scarcely do better than to contrive to get basically good people to inflict such suffering upon one another by their own hands, not his, in the belief that by so doing they were combating him. By turning their own basic goodness against them, he would then have legions of unwitting agents doing his work for him. And this is the spirit behind Satan in Milton's Paradise Lost. And I'll just quote one fragment of a stanza. This is Satan speaking. He says, "If then God's providence out of our evil seek to bring forth good, our labor must be to pervert that end, and out of good still to find means of evil." So if there is a devil, and if the devil can get good people to kill one another, inflict pain, suffering, death, deprivation upon one another, then they can do the work of the devil for him. And they do it by their own hands. And they do it in the belief that they're actually fighting against the devil. And Milton sees this and puts this thought in Satan's mind in his words. By the same token, any evil intention may be unattended by evil motivation. One might deliberately target innocent persons in warfare in the belief that only by so doing is one likely to defeat the enemy, an end deemed to be good. And the explanation of that action might be the desire to achieve that good. An evil person, if we move, I've talked about evil intention, evil motive. An evil person is one in whom evil motives predominate, in whom the basic traits that make up the person's very character are evil. The paradigm evil person is one in whom evil motives and intentions predominate to the extent of constituting an evil character, whose conduct is typically evil and which takes pleasure or satisfaction in the doing of evil. Typically, this would be manifest overtly in one's actions. Typically, the evil motivation would be accompanied by evil intentions. This would certainly be true in the paradigm case of evil, but it might not always be true. A person might lack the courage or the opportunity or means to act upon his evil motives. Whether that is so and to what extent would depend upon the circumstances in which he finds himself. Racists and anti-Semites and sexists might secretly harbor malice towards members of the relevant target groups, but conceal this behind outwardly liberal tendencies, though one suspects that their conduct would eventually betray that motivation. So you might have this motivation, evil motivation, but still one might not act upon it for various reasons, lack of circumstance, lack of courage, and so on. If there are unconscious motives, then the biases of racists, sexists, and anti-Semites, as well as streaks of evil in some person's character, might even be concealed from themselves. So one might not even be aware of that in oneself. A person may occasionally perform an evil act without being an evil person. That is, there can be strains of evil or streaks of evil in persons without, as a person, as a whole, their character, without there being evil people. Basically, good people may occasionally do evil. One doesn't cease to be a good person over a lifetime by occasionally doing something evil, any more than one fails to be a vegetarian by virtue of occasionally eating meat. Perhaps, though this is more problematic, one may even occasionally take pleasure in the doing of something evil and still be basically a good person. To be an evil person, the motivation to do evil, and in the paradigm case, the doing of evil, has to have become part of one's character. There must be a tendency or a predisposition or even a habit of doing evil before one is transformed into an evil person. Now, are there evil persons in the world? And you remember I said that there are various notions we can clarify or define quite independently of the question whether they correspond to anything in the world. So we can define what a unicorn is. We know there aren't any such things as unicorns. We can define a square circle. We know there are no such things as square circles. We can define the conditions of a just war, and it's problematic whether there are in fact any just wars and so on. I've proposed a way of understanding what an evil person is, and now we can ask the question, well, are there any such persons, evil persons in the world? Or is there more moral evil in the world? Yes, there is evil in the world if we're talking about evil acts. And if we're talking about evil in persons, that is, evil motives and intentions, there almost certainly is some such evil. But my guess is that there is much less of it than one might suppose. And such of it as there is manifest in relatively minor matters, probably mostly in personal relations. Are there evil persons? Granted that there may be strains of evil in motivation and intention. Possibly, but there may not be. If there are, my guess is that there are very few, and they probably don't account for much of the evil that is done in the world. Just speaking personally, I've never met a single person who I thought was an evil person in the sense I've characterized, in which evil motivation and intentions predominate in their character. Maybe there are such people. I've never met one. Most of what we call evil, that is evil acts, is caused by people acting with good intentions, and probably from good motives as well. The greatest suffering and destruction one finds inflicted by persons is warfare. And almost always, at least in modern warfare, both sides believe they're in the right. Both sides believe they have a just cause. Even when governments act in what they believe is their national interest, they probably believe that it is morally legitimate to do so. They inflict the death and destruction they do, not for its own sake, but as a means to an end, repelling what they see as aggression or a violation of rights or a threat to their national interest. Often they're motivated by patriotism, and although they take satisfaction in successfully vanquishing enemies, they believe that the suffering they inflict is deserved, and the notion of what is deserved is central here, brought upon their enemies by their own evil ways. Consider two horrendous events of the 20th century, the Holocaust and the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. In each case, innocent civilians were killed. In the Holocaust, by the millions over a period of years. At Hiroshima, by the tens of thousands in an instant, and thousands more over the years from the effects of radiation. If we were to catalog evils, these would be near the top of most people's lists. But were they moral evils? In the case of Hiroshima, it seems not. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima and later Nagasaki probably wasn't intended to inflict undeserved suffering, certainly not for its own sake. It was meant to hasten an end to the war and thereby to save lives. Even though the suffering and death of most of the individual persons was almost certainly undeserved, the bombing, viewed as an act, not primarily against them as individuals, but against the collectivity to which they belonged, the Japanese nation, was thought by the U.S. government and the majority of Americans to be deserved. It was payback for Pearl Harbor. The Holocaust is more complex. Both Jews and communists were perceived by Hitler as threats to the German nation. German nation understood as so-called Aryan people. Indeed, he speaks as though it's not only the German nation that is at stake, but the flourishing of humankind as a whole, which was thought to require the preeminence of the German nation. Only through the defeat of communism and the implementation of proper eugenics could humankind flourish. That is, proper breeding of human beings. And a popular notion among the Germans, and it's one they got from a lot of American scientists in the early part of the century, was that just as we have no qualms about breeding animals and trying to get the traits that we want, they thought you could do the same thing with human beings, and you could improve the human species, so to speak, by so doing. And that was part of the agenda of the Nazi government. The philosophy implicit in Mein Kampf places race and anti-communism at its center. It's rooted in the long-standing anti-Semitism of Europe, transformed into an ideology by a rabid anti-communism and combined with eugenics, the attempt to improve the human species by breeding. The point is that there are grounds for thinking that the terrible death and destruction inflicted upon Jews, communists, gypsies, homosexuals, and others by the Nazis, at least initially were thought of as means to an end they took to be good. It was a key belief in their thinking. That this belief was egregiously mistaken is beside the point. It needs to be recognized in order to understand the actions to which they contributed. Even if it could be established that those actions were performed for the sake of the suffering they caused, rather than as a means to an end, the evidence overwhelmingly points to the conclusion that the suffering was thought to be deserved. In the Nazi view, Jews and communists were out to corrupt and take over the German nation. The Nazis believed this. Even if particular Jews and communists were not guilty, the collectivities to which they belonged were guilty and deserved punishment or extermination. Were the Nazis evil persons individually in the sense defined above? Some perhaps, but it's difficult to know for certain. To know that a person is evil requires knowledge of his motives and intentions of a sort that is difficult to come by. St. Augustine and Immanuel Kant recognized the difficulty here, as did early Christian theologians like Aquinas, who argued that divine law is necessary to cover the inner life of persons that can't be regulated by human law. Adultery in the heart is as bad as bad morally as adultery in fact, but human law can't effectively regulate the former. So if a person commits adultery, you can have laws, and most states did have laws at one time against adultery, and it's a physical act. It can be documented, verified. People can be punished for it. But how do you punish people by law for what is in their heart or what they fantasize about? You can't. While Aquinas thought you had to have, in addition to human law, you had to have God's divine law to regulate what goes on in the hearts and the minds of people as well. How many of the Nazis were governed by evil motives and intentions, and precisely which ones were so governed, is difficult to know for certain, particularly since we executed most of the Nazi leadership at the end of the war following Nuremberg. Some of them were sadistic and took pleasure in humiliating and killing Jews in particular. They obviously displayed some of the ingredients of evil. But whether they combined this with the belief that the suffering they inflicted was undeserved is problematic. With regard to the so-called war on terrorism more recently, the 9/11 attacks are thought by most Americans as evil, and Osama bin Laden, their presumed perpetrator, a paradigm of evil. But if we compare bin Laden and then President George Bush at the time the key events were unfolding, we see, first of all, that both were millionaires, very wealthy men, who had especially privileged upbringings. Secondly, both were devoutly religious. Thirdly, both were convinced that they and their religion have the truth with a capital T, Islam on the one hand, Christianity on the other, and both were willing to kill and cause destruction or have others do so on their behalf in pursuit of what they believed was right. These seem to be all facts, and they equally apply to both George Bush and Osama bin Laden. If anything, the suffering unleashed by Bush's attack on Afghanistan and Iraq probably dwarfs anything that can plausibly be, in quantitative terms, attributed to bin Laden. And insofar as the willingness to sacrifice personally is a sign of commitment, bin Laden forsook a life of ease and comfort for that of a fugitive and a terrorist. Is one man good and the other evil? Perhaps, but there's not much in the way of available evidence to say that one is worse than the other, or that they are not both in their ways, albeit each misguided in the view of the other, equally good. There's a paradox here. Call it the paradox of evil. It is, and this is my proposal, it is that the greatest evils in the world are done by basically good people. And that truly evil people, if there be such, are usually hurtful only to a small number of persons with whom they interact closely. The greatest harm, at least of a mental or psychological sort, can often be inflicted only on those one knows well, such as spouses, family members, or children, over whom one has control. Vulnerability comes with intimacy, and some people exploit that vulnerability. Perhaps a few of them do it from an evil character and take pleasure in it. If so, then they are evil persons by my definition. Most people probably do evil things from time to time. There may even be some evil people, that is, some in whom evil tendencies predominate, though, as I've said, I suspect that if they are relatively few. The evil that most people do is probably at war with basically good impulses within them. This is reflected in the repeated use of the metaphor of war to characterize the conflict within each person. One finds this metaphor used over and over historically, from Buddhism to the Bhagavad Gita to Plato to Augustine and so on. My guess is that those good impulses are rarely overwhelmed to such an extent as to render the person as a whole evil. In short, while the infliction of harm, death, and destruction abounds in the world, moral evil probably does not, and even where it exists, almost certainly difficult to identify with any confidence, because it requires knowledge of motivation of a sort that we rarely have. So while those who cause great harm and suffering are commonly called evil, it is probably best to understand that as a merely descriptive, derivative sense. We can't justifiably call them evil in the moral sense unless we know much more about them than simply what their acts have led to. Moral evil is essentially inward and subjective, as Augustine saw. It may even be that some evil is purely subjective in the sense that some people may harbor malice towards others but never act upon it, at least in ways that resemble violence. In them it may simply fester, rarely receiving outward expression, and in the end harming only themselves. If I'm correct, most of the unnecessary suffering, death, and destruction caused in the world is a manifestation of not moral evil, but this descriptive evil. It consists of the acts of basically good people operating with various admixtures of false beliefs, misperceptions, biases, bad judgment, and outright ignorance. They are governed for the most part not by malice, but by fear. By fear, I include insecurity, apprehension, anxiety, worry, suspicion, and a host of related notions at one end, through outright terror at the other extreme. That is, this whole gamut of terms, I think, that represent different forms of fear. Terror at one extreme is the extreme of fear, but worry, suspicion, anxiety, and so on tend towards the other extreme. Sometimes people fear for their lives or for the lives of those close to them. Other times they fear for their possessions. Often they just fear for their future, wanting assurance that it will be secure. At the social and international level, where by far the greatest evils, descriptive evils, are found, at least as measured quantitatively, it's probably more often fear of loss of possessions, or political independence, or territorial integrity. Sometimes, in the case of threatened genocide, it's fear for the survival not only of the state, but of a people. Often, however, it's fear on the part of individual leaders for their own political careers. They worry about how they will be perceived in times of crisis, whether they'll be thought to display weakness. This may lead them to take actions that bring great suffering, both to those they would protect and to those whose actions have created their predicament. Fear can lead people to do terrible things, but it is a different motive from malice. Fear is always of loss of some sort, whether personal, social, or political. It is self-referential, in that it represents a concern to preserve something one has or what those have whom one identifies with. Malice is a desire to cause suffering for its own sake. It is other-directed. Malice remains unsatisfied unless one is able to cause harm or suffering to those who are its objects. The central problem is to others are motivated ultimately by fear, then threatening them with violence or trying to inflict pain, suffering, and death upon them won't remove that fear. It will only intensify it. This is at the heart of Gandhi and King's claims that violence begets violence. If those who are violent are governed by fear, then using violence in turn against them won't remove that fear. It will only confirm them in their judgments and perceptions from which the fear springs. This is also the key to understanding the contention of Gandhi and King and philosopher John Dewey in the philosophical world that means and ends are intricately related, that the means you adopt affect the very character of the end that you have, meaning in the last analysis that immoral means can't achieve moral ends. On the international scene, peace is commonly sought by means of war, but war fails over and over to achieve peace, other than temporarily. And the peace it does achieve is nothing more than the absence of war, not peace with justice and tranquility among peoples. The death and destruction wrought by violence cannot remove the fear governing those who are perceived as constituting the threat the violence is intended to counteract. This is why the so-called war on terrorism will fail. By having militarized the campaign against terrorism, we virtually ensured its failure. The very means we have chosen will undercut the attainment of the end. Inflicting pain, suffering, death, and destruction on more Muslims will only increase the bitterness that has bred terrorism in the first place. Thousands were killed in Afghanistan and Iraq. Not a one of them was shown to have been involved in, at least when these attacks took place, or even to have known about the 9/11 attacks. Tens of thousands of them were civilians. To deal effectively with evil, one must rely upon means that dispel fear in others. That is, to deal effectively with the harm, the suffering, and death that people cause, basically good people cause, one must rely upon means that dispel fear in others. And only nonviolence can do that. If those who are violent on the social and international scene are motivated by fear, violence against them can eliminate that fear only by eliminating those who have the fear. But killing them only generates fear in others. When there's no possibility of eliminating all those who threaten the evil one opposes, as in the case of terrorism, one not only spreads the fear to others, one intensifies it in those who survive. When it's intensified to the point where it metastasizes into hatred, the means adopted to combat terrorism succeed instead in increasing it. And that's, I propose, what we're seeing in the world now. Here I'm relying upon a theory that was proposed by one of my students, a freshman student a number of years ago. I have my students keep a journal and I give them topics to write on. And a student proposed, I won't quote the whole of the passage, but the student said that in her view, hatred is simply intensified fear. And that seemed to me a very perceptive observation. After 9/11, you heard people saying, well, why do they hate us? Why do they hate us? These undefined people out in the world who are terrorists and so on. Why do they hate us? And perhaps the answer is because they fear us. And that fear has reached such a threshold that it has transformed itself into hatred. Marxists point out that in certain areas, increasing quantitative changes bring about qualitative changes. Water heated beyond a certain point undergoes a transformation. It turns to steam. When it's cooled beyond a certain point, and these are all quantitatively measurable, then it undergoes another transformation and it turns to ice. So I would suggest fear and anger, intensified beyond a certain degree, become transformed into hatred. And hatred thrives on threats from those who are hated. It is fueled by those threats. Every act of violence simply strengthens the grip of hatred over persons. You can kill such people. To be sure, the hatred embodied in those particular individuals dies with them. But this only inflames the fear and anger in others that sets the stage for their coming to hate as well. Violence begets violence, not because of any exotic metaphysical principle, but because of its very nature. It is in the nature of violence to breed violence. Nonviolence represents an active way of not cooperating with bad and evil that others do, thus undercutting the perpetuation of evil. This may be at the heart of the Taoist thought that if you give evil nothing to oppose, it will disappear by itself. If others have no reason to fear you, and if their violence and the evil, if it involves evil, spring from fear, then this can only be dispelled by nonviolence. To deal with violence nonviolently requires courage, as Gandhi and King point out. This means, once again, that fear is central. We must overcome the fear within ourselves in order to act nonviolently, and both Gandhi and King maintain that nonviolence requires far more courage than violence does. We have to overcome fear within ourselves in order to act nonviolently. Courage is not having no fear. It consists precisely in overcoming fear. To dispel fear in others, we must overcome it within ourselves. The practical upshot is that if the preceding analysis is correct, our current repertoire of responses to violence and wrongdoing, by using force and violence, is counterproductive and serves to perpetuate violence and to incite even more bitterness and hatred than they dispel. If so, the need is to create nonviolent responses to evil and wrongdoing. To provide these is the challenge to a philosophy of nonviolence. Thank you.